Goodman. We're talking about the $900 million settlement that's been reached between the U.S. Justice Department and GM over the deaths of over 120 people, 124 people, for a faulty ignition switch that they knew about for over a decade. Among our guests today, Laura Christian, mother of Amber Rose. She was 16 years old when she died as a result of this faulty ignition switch in the car, which crashed. Ralph Nader, who's long taken on General Motors, and Rena Steinzor, who wrote the book Why Not Jail? Industrial Catastrophes, Corporate Malfeasance, and Government Inaction. Professor Steinzor, can you respond to this settlement and what you think needs to happen? Do you think the government sold out to General Motors?
Yes, I think the government sold out to General Motors, and what it did is part of a much larger trend. The name of this kind of agreement is Deferred Prosecution Agreement, and what that means is that companies can pay a hefty fine that to them is just a cost of doing business and avoid any admission that they committed criminal acts. The U.S. Attorney has filed a statement of facts about what happened here that in and of itself is pretty shocking. There were efforts to cover up the ignition switch defect going back as far as 2001. At one point, the GM engineer who was in charge of the switch, Ray DiGiorno, secretly changed the part without telling anybody. And so Cobalts from 2005 and Saturns from 2005 on were safe, but cars were left on the road, hundreds of thousands of them, that still had the faulty switch that GM acknowledged was faulty by changing the part. GM spent years procrastinating. They had various work groups, task forces, who sat around palavering about what to do. They still dragged their feet when their outside counsel told them they risked punitive damages in some of the tort cases. And finally, they rushed to the Justice Department and said, "I'm sorry," and were able to escape without having to plead guilty. This happened most notoriously in the case of HSBC, the huge worldwide bank, which was laundering money for Mexican drug cartel. And the Justice Department gave them the same kind of settlement, deferred prosecution agreement, which is a favorite of the Obama administration's Justice Department and really denies justice to the victims of the bad acts that are covered in a statement but never brought to court.
Professor Steinzor, Ralph Nader mentioned that drivers were prosecuted.
Yes.
Even though General Motors knew it was their fault, they had a faulty ignition switch. Can you tell us some of the stories of those drivers?
Yes. The one that is most vivid in my mind is the case of Candace Anderson, who was driving a Saturn, and she ran the car into a tree after she lost control of it. It's really important to try and focus on how upsetting it is to have a car stall out as you're driving it. You lose the steering, the brakes, the airbags you find out aren't working once you crash, but by then you've already been through this terrible experience. Unfortunately, her fiancé was killed in that crash, and she was indicted for reckless homicide. Fortunately, they gave her probation, but not until her parents had emptied their retirement account to pay for her defense. And only years later did a judge vacate her plea when GM admitted that the switch was faulty. So the double standard for white-collar criminals and the average person is revealed in sharp relief by this very sad case.
Let's turn to Samantha Denty of Toms River, New Jersey, describing what happened when she drove a GM car with a faulty ignition switch.
Driving this car was like playing a game of Russian roulette with my safety and that of my friends. I can't even begin to explain the fear and confusion that runs through you that moment when you have no control over your car. I cannot comprehend the loss that these families behind me are going through. My hope is that the horror stops right now. I don't want any more drivers to be mourned by family and friends because an automaker hit a deadly problem. The federal government failed to take action, and drivers like me were kept in the dark.
So there you have Samantha Denty, Professor Steinzor. Continue with the point that she is making.
Well, I also want to make clear that the supposed reason for not being tough with GM for letting them walk, in addition to the fact that they apologize so nicely, is that there's a gap in the law. And it's certainly true that it would be much better to have strong provisions that targeted hiding defects very specifically. But what GM is guilty, and the U.S. Attorney did acknowledge this, of wire fraud. It sold these cars, pre-owned compacts, as safe, even though it knew that there were ignition switch problems. It didn't replace the switches on the cars it sold itself. It certified that they were safe to the people that bought them, and it advertised them in the media and pushed these sales. And that is multiple felonies could be charged on the basis of that, and have been charged in other cases that involve deadly products, including peanut butter that was contaminated by salmonella. The Justice Department went to trial on that case, and the sentencing is next Monday. They got felony convictions. The company was small. That's one difference. There's a compounding pharmacy up in Massachusetts that sold steroid injections contaminated by fungal meningitis, and 64 people died as a result. That company has been charged with conspiracy and second-degree murder. So the Justice Department knows perfectly well how, under existing law, to make tough cases. We need stronger laws, but it is no excuse for what happened here, which is to turn their back on the victims, basically, and not hold the company accountable. There isn't a victim who's spoken out who is satisfied with this settlement.
So, Laura Christian, are you not consulted in any way, since this settlement money doesn't go to you, it goes to the government?
Well, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with the money, in my opinion. None of the families that I spoke to, and I've spoken to quite a few, none of us care about the money. What we care about is seeing real justice. And to us, the only thing that that's going to mean is someone actually going to jail. The one thing that we are vehemently denied by the federal government. For what purpose, I don't know. Is GM just too big? I don't understand.
You met with Mary Barra, is that right?
That's correct.
Talk about this meeting, the CEO of General Motors.
I found her to be extraordinarily cold, actually. You have to picture the room. We're in a very large conference room, 30 family members, Kleenex in front of each and every single one of us, Mary Barra at the head, surrounded by her 2 attorneys, and each family member told their story. There was not a dry eye in that room, with the exception of Mary Barra and her 2 attorneys. She said the same thing over and over again. I'm so sorry for your loss. When I asked her about what they were doing and would they be willing to park those vehicles, she would not answer me, saying that this was under investigation.
I want to ask about pending legislation to improve auto safety. This is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, followed by Democratic Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who you've worked with, Laura Christian.
Senator Markey and I are here today to urge you, General Motors, to address the unconscionable acts of your company in failing to disclose serious defects in many of your cars. Innocent lives were lost.
There are Americans right now driving defective cars down highways at great speeds whose lives are at risk, and they are unaware of the risk they are taking. Senator Blumenthal and I have introduced legislation that will improve vehicle safety and increase reporting and transparency so that the public knows sooner about possible deadly defects.
So, Ralph Nader, how would that work?
Well, it would basically say that any company that knowingly and willfully violates government safety standards, resulting in death and injury, can be criminally prosecuted, and as well the officials inside the company. So it's prosecution of the company, prosecution of officials. Senator John Thune from Nebraska, Congressman Fred Upton from Michigan have been blocking Senator Blumenthal and Senator Markey's efforts. They deserve to be contacted by people all over the country. If we had criminal penalties when we were pressing for them in 1966, and the GM lobbyists led by Lloyd Cutler, the corporate lawyer, blocked that, you wouldn't see this situation today. How many times do corporate executives privately have to tell people the only deterrence is their fear of jail? That's what it is. And what we have now is corporations who got chartered many, many decades ago to limit the liability of shareholders now have limited the liability of the corporation itself. And the mockery is that General Motors and Mary Barra, the CEO, are using shareholder money and taxpayer money to pay this flimsy $900 million settlement fine, and they're off scot-free. I mean, listeners have got to be very indignant about the way corporate criminals get off. They get very indignant when individual criminals, street criminals, don't get severe penalties, but they don't get as angry about corporate criminals and the toll of death, injury, and disease that is traced to corporations like hospital-induced infections, medical malpractice, air pollution, unsafe products, occupational disease. We're talking hundreds of thousands of deaths plus more injuries and disease every year that are preventable, but the law doesn't exist.
Well, don't the studies show that when corporate individuals are held accountable, when there is a threat of jail, the crime wave goes down?
Of course. But the problem is we haven't had much experience with what you just described, Amy. The Wall Street crash, nobody responsible for it, and J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, AIG, they weren't prosecuted. It's too bad Eliot Spitzer was no longer Attorney General. He would have done it. But they weren't prosecuted. They caught a few large traders, insider trading. That doesn't affect the crash of Wall Street, unemploying 8 million people, shredding pensions, mutual funds. And they have the gall, after they jumped ship and tanked their own companies in Wall Street, to go to Washington, where the former head of Goldman Sachs was the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Paulson, and demand and get a bailout. Citigroup got a huge multi-billion-dollar bailout on a weekend, secretly talking with the officials in Washington. Now, this country is being corporatized into the ground. Its democracy is being driven into the ground. The rights of people. That's why we're very heartened by Laura Christian and the victims and the families of the victims, because they're not going to go away. And victims and families of product defects all over the country should organize, network, and go after the members of Congress. Politicians can stare us down when we testify, Amy. They can't stare people like Laura Christian down.
Let me go back to some of the reports from the last years. This is Reuters 2014. A former head of General Motors corporate quality audit warned the company's board in a letter in 2002, that's what, 13 years ago, that it needed to stop the continued shipment of unsafe vehicles and recall suspect vehicles that were already in customers' hands. This is years before Amber died, Laura's daughter. The letter from William McAleer shows that GM's directors and top management were told about serious safety defects in vehicles that were coming off the company's production lines more than 11 years before GM recalled millions of vehicles for faulty ignition switches linked to, at that time, at least 13 deaths. Last year, Business Week wrote about Cortland Kelly, a third-generation, 30-year GM employee who was the former head of a nationwide GM inspection program. He was forced to sue GM in 2003, 12 years ago, after the company repeatedly ignored his reports of flaws. And Business Week also reported on how GM's outside lawyer Peter Kellett pressed Cortland Kelly to admit that raising concerns about trucks wasn't part of his job description as an inspector of cars. Kelly said, "My job assignment as a GM employee is to make sure our customers are safe in any way that I can. That's my understanding," Kelly said. GM said, "But was it your specific understanding that you were charged with responsibility for monitoring information relating to vehicles other than the small cars?" Those were quotes from deposition. When you listen to this, Laura Christian, your feelings?
Absolute disgust. You know, once again, you know, GM puts profit above safety, as they always have. You know, this is nothing new. This is truly nothing new. And you know, there's one thing I do want to point out is that, you know, so many people out there think that this is not something that's going to happen to them. So they don't get active. They don't take part in. They don't write their senators. They don't write their representatives. Well, I can tell you firsthand, I was one of those people that thought that this was never going to happen to me. You know, the likes of GM would never affect my life directly. And, you know, I can tell you that it has. You know, the fact that such corruption exists is not entirely shocking. The fact that we allow it to continue to exist, that we don't prosecute when these opportunities, you know, rear itself in the glaring light of day, you know, that...
Who do you think should be prosecuted?
Well, certainly Ray DeGiorgio. He's number one on, I think, everybody's list.
And explain, because for those who aren't familiar and steeped in this as much as you are.
Oh, certainly. Ray DeGiorgio is the engineer that was in charge of this particular ignition switch. He was the one that knew that there was not enough pressure or torque in these vehicles, meaning that it was going to be able to go from the on position to the accessory position. He knew this. He gave the order at Delphi to go ahead and manufacture this particular part, even though it did not meet GM's own specifications. He later on, you know, had the model changed itself, had the switch redesigned, but did not change the actual part number, thus concealing it not only to all consumers everywhere, not only to the federal government, but to some at GM as well. I understand it made it a little bit more difficult to figure out what was going on, though nevertheless, it did come to light. Counsel in GM knew. Counsel, you know, basically, in some cases, strong-armed certain victims' parents, family members to accept minimal amounts of money, in some cases, bullied them against suing GM at all.
Professor Steinzor, why aren't these people prosecuted when you have specific people that are known? And I know this can go right up to the top, obviously, and we're talking about many years now.
Well, that's a really good question. You know, actually, certainly, you're going to be able to answer that a little bit more than I. Do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Professor
Steinzor? I think it is a lack of will on the part of the prosecutors. They just don't have the stomach to bring the cases for reasons that I can't understand. And it's worth taking one step back. Laura is talking about all the consumers who have trouble with their cars. Remember the Toyota sudden acceleration. Now we're in the middle of a massive recall involving Takata airbags. We have the GM ignition switch. Last year, 64 million vehicles were recalled. Some of them were for non-safety defects, but a vast majority were for safety defects. So we clearly have a problem throughout the auto industry, and yet we have not seen individual prosecutions, and Toyota got another one of these, I don't have to admit I'm wrong, settlements, deferred prosecution agreement. It paid more money because it wasn't as contrite with the Justice Department itself as GM was. But as Laura has said so eloquently, the money, which is really not a big deal to these companies, it's a cost of doing business, does not have the same deterrent effect in the future to save other consumers.
Well, last week, I mean, the Justice Department understands this full well. Last week, the Justice Department unveiled new guidelines intended to increase the prosecution of executives involved in white-collar crime. Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates said, quote, "Corporations can only commit crimes through flesh and blood people. It's only fair that the people who are responsible for committing those crimes be held accountable. The public needs to have confidence that there is one system of justice, and it applies equally regardless of whether that crime occurs on a street corner or in a boardroom." Again, that's Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates. That's not Ralph Nader saying that, but Ralph Nader, your response.
Yeah, words, words, words. We want to see the deeds. In addition to lack of will by these federal prosecutors that Professor Steinzor pointed out, there's anticipatory greed. Hardly a month goes by when the New York Times or Wall Street Journal doesn't report that a top federal prosecutor leaves the job and triples or quadruples his or her salary by going into the very corporate law firms that were defending these corporations. So there's this merry-go-round that goes on. Now, if you're a federal prosecutor and you know if you're too tough, you're not going to get that $500,000 or $1 million a year job, there's an inhibitory factor, and it affects the Securities Exchange Commission, it affects the Justice Department. So people can just Google and see, just a few days ago, another top prosecutor in New York left to join a firm.
Ralph Nader.
The other thing is, so last quick point. When was the last time any reporter asked any of these presidential candidates in the last 50 years, what is your position on corporate crime enforcement? What is your position on corporate crime abuses and violence of taxpayers, of contracts, of people's lives and injuries and their health and safety? That's the big taboo, Amy, that's going on here.
Well, Ralph, I want to ask you to stay on for the next segment to comment on the 2015-16 presidential campaign, but I want to get Laura Christian's last comment on what you're doing on Facebook right now as you organize.
Well, I'm continuing to reach out to speak to the family members and other people that have been affected by these recalls, but also to give information, what recalls are out there. And also people have questions. You know, my car's been recalled, the parts are not in. You know, GM or the other auto manufacturers that are out there will not give me a loaner. What do I do? I try to help people individually, and I try to give advice as well as comfort to people that are going through the same thing.
The Facebook page, GM Recall Survivors. I want to thank you both for being with us. Laura Christian, the mother of Amber Rose, who died after a 2005 Chevrolet Cobalt crashed and the airbag failed to deploy on July 29, 2005. Amber Rose was 16 years old. I also want to thank Professor Rena Steinzor, professor at the University of Maryland School of Law, author of Why Not Jail? Industrial Catastrophes, Corporate Malfeasance, and Government Inaction. Ralph Nader will stay with us to comment on the elections this year. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.